can be confusing for adults to sift through the amount of information that's being thrown at us. Kids are just so susceptible that it does. That's why another reason why I'm concerned with the affirmation only narrative and system. And that any questioning of any trans identity at any point is always transphobic. And it's, I just know it, like, I know it myself at this point. I know a lot of trans people, and I know that transphobia just isn't something that exists in my heart, really. Like, I'm sure I have biases like anyone else, but I genuinely love a lot of trans people. And although I do see trans women as biological men, I don't like perceive them as biological men unless, they're behaving in a super biologically male way. Not to sound fucked up, but like I perceive them almost as like their own unique space, and I use my preferred pronouns people use. And it's
so let me ask you a question, because I'd love to dig into this, because you will obviously hear one side say trans women are women, which, doesn't, I think lots of people can disagree. It doesn't make sense. But then you have the hardline gender critical side. I don't even know if you call it hardline, but they would say there's no such thing as living as a woman. Like, what does that mean? That's what they'll say. What are your thoughts on that?
I'm still ironing out a lot of my views on this, which is why I have these conversations, because it helps illuminate my own boundaries. But like, broadly speaking, I do think that we need, from a legal perspective, to keep the legal definition of woman to broadly mean adult human female, because that's the most useful definition for the most amount of people in the most situations. But that's not to say that trans people now don't exist or don't have their own unique obstacles and unique status in society. Because the fact is, sometimes I explain like it's like I'm bisexual, and if I'm attracted to like a trans woman who's made the effort to appear female, I'm experiencing that attraction in the way that I feel attracted to women in general, because my two attractions feel different. The way I experience my attraction to women and men feels very different, and I approach them very differently. So in a way, I do perceive trans women as like a type of woman, but for legal and in these specific philosophical arguments, it's important to stay in the reality that they are in fact biologically male, because we can't even get to that level of like nuance about like perception, whatever, because we can't get past the reality, the shared reality point, because people can't even say, they think if I say that a trans woman's a biological male, they then draw all these other beliefs out of that. When I'm just trying to describe reality, I do not think at this time we have the technology to change sex. Maybe we will in the future. We probably will if we keep at this. Who knows? With gene editing and shit like that. Like, but as of right now, we cannot meaningfully change sex. And me saying that goes against the kind of mainstream narrative, even though they deny that they say that. It's like, it's confusing, because people will say like, oh, no trans person is saying biological sex doesn't exist. Yeah, I have this argument all day, every day on Twitter about biological sex existing. So it's like, obviously there is like a substantial amount of people who are confused about the reality of sex itself. And there's a lot of, like studies that are like, yeah, sex is so much more confusing than we thought. And it's just like, there hasn't actually been any new info about sex being confusing. It's just the prevalence of critical gender that has come up. Like, we haven't had any new data like, wow, like there's so many intersex people we didn't know about. And it's like, there are like maybe 1% of people who are intersex, but it's like, it doesn't make sense.
One or less. And the intersex thing kills me, because
it's such a red herring.
It is. And people equip themselves with that in trans debates constantly. And now you have your own, intersex section of the flag with, the yellow and the purple circle. And, there's a nightclub night in London, and it has a room. I can't remember what it's called, but they basically put together the acronym because they felt like the night was too cis het male. Too cis gay male, like two. And bear in mind, like a lot of club nights, at least where I am, some of them started as gay men's nights, but now everything is queer. Nothing is allowed to be men only. but
It's like,
they have
that's great.
another
There's
room.
queer spaces, but like, I just think everyone should be able to like create spaces how they please without being told they're a bigot, you know, like within
Yeah,
reason.
as long as they're like, if you're upfront about it. There's another. I keep going in so many rabbit holes here, but there's another. There's a gentlemen's club in London, and it's like mainly very affluent men, like some really famous men are in it. And there's been all these articles in kind of left-leaning newspapers like The Guardian slating it and saying that it shouldn't exist because it's like misogynistic. And it's like, no, like if women want one like that, they can create one.
Yeah. That's the other
So
thing. And women are so guilty of this, broadly speaking, of like, men will make something and we're like, what about it? And it's like, hey, we're free, baby. It's not the 40s anymore, baby. We can do whatever the fuck we want. You know, like, get with the program. Go build your own shit. You know, let's do it. Like, enough of the hating and tearing other people down for doing shit. It's so lame.
It's so interesting you say that, because so much of these issues, you can trace a lot of them back to people have forgotten that we're mammals, and they don't want to acknowledge that there are differences between the sexes, like on average, right?
Yeah,
so
that's a huge component.
I think something Dr. Deborah So, do you know where she is?
I'm familiar with her work, like, peripherally, but I haven't super dived into it.
I think something she said in her book was, so I mean, psychologically, men are more likely to have narcissistic tendencies, and women are more likely to have neurotic tendencies. So, you know, you think of one side having an ego and the other side having a tendency towards negative mood. Now, when you think of that from an evolutionary standpoint, it makes perfect sense, because the female has to be sort of more pessimistic, because she needs to look after those kids and make sure, like, you know, you'd rather be overly cautious that kid doesn't fall over or like get eaten by a bear or something than not care. Whereas like men potentially have to go out and fight and, you know, trust their instincts and not be intimidated in scary situations. So sort of have an inflated sense of who they are. And then that leads into this, like, men wanting to empire build and make these things. But I think Deborah So said, the more a society tries to reach a point of making men and women the exact same, the more women will grow in neuroticism and men will grow in narcissism, right? And I feel like you can sort of see it, you know?
Yeah, for sure. I'm so with you. I do think a huge component we're missing is that, like, the biological just reality. Like, we are mammals. Look across mammals. You will see a lot of these behaviors and patterns emerging because they're evolutionarily useful, not because they're evil. It's not good or bad. You know, it just is. It just is that men tend to be stronger. It just is that men tend to be overrepresented in geniuses and idiots. These things aren't, and it just is that women tend to be more nurturing and more pro-social and more neurotic in a lot of ways, and more, like, we each have our strong points and shortcomings that almost like there isn't a better, worse sex. And this whole conversation is so, the sex wars too is like another obstacle. I'm trying to, like, I would so like to, like, heal the relations between men and women. And a lot of that, in order for us to understand each other, we need to be real about our biological influences and limitations, because that is what is driving everything. We don't exist in a vacuum. We evolved like every other creature on this planet, you know? So I do think that's a really important perspective to understand, like, what's really going on, you know? But people get triggered.
I wonder if it started becoming, so you can trace all these things back, like, you know, the patriarchy to men wanting to empire build, and, like, you know, it made sense just from a system point of view that, you know, that women were at home and men went to work or whatever. Not saying that that's right or wrong, or that you shouldn't have personal choice, because I think everyone should. But I think it's like, you know, and it's happening more now with AI and everything, but we got to a point where technology just started exponentially changing. So then you had this massive booming civilization where these evolutionary strategies that we have were not equipped to suddenly have this massive patriarchal system. And then men started believing that women actually can't do things that they can do, and they're not as intelligent. And I just wonder if a lot of those, so when biology starts becoming sexist, I wonder if that is a consequence of how rapidly technology and civilization has expanded. Because when you start referring to differences between the sexes, people view that as sexism, but they're completely different things.
Exactly.
Sexism is recognizing a difference or saying there is a difference and then treating someone indifferently because of the difference, right?
It's about treating individuals based on broad characteristics of groups, which is never wise because every individual is different. But like broadly speaking, I think a lot of women, we almost like hyper internalize the like feminist message, like, and it's like feminism has been like empowering and great for me in some ways, but I also noticed I got too, like, I started to view any natural female thing almost with a negative. It was almost like more sexist, like, oh, if I'm more nurturing or if I want monogamy instead of like one night stands or these desires myself, I felt like weren't good, like they're bad because it was almost like I'm trying to replicate a masculine ideal even though I say I'm being feminist. It's like I'm not willing to actually step into like being a woman in everything that means and accepting my biological realities, limitations, and making the best of that because there's just no
Exactly.
progress or anything
And
if you
the
can't.
reference point is always masculine behavior. So when you try and make the sexes the same, it's
Mhm.
always trying to push women to be as career hungry, as promiscuous,
Mhm.
like, um, I mean, I've encountered women personally who I think probably feel pressure to care less about sex. And I think
Mhm.
if you're someone who can sleep with someone and then it's a one night stand and it's really fun and it doesn't have any lasting effects on you, I think that's absolutely great. I think the more
Yeah.
we can drive personal choice, but the problem is now, the feminist movement sort of made it so, and the inflation made it so you can no longer have a stay-at-home mother, at least in really
Mhm.
rare cases, even if she really wants to.
Yeah.
Um, so now, but you do have lots of women then, if they do choose to stay home, they have this like inner anxiety of people will view them as this trad wife who has nothing
Yeah.
interesting about her,
Yeah.
even though deep down that's what she wants to do. But then the experience itself is sort of tainted because of this, fear that people won't see her going after this career.
Yeah, and that's
So
a really damaging mentality when as a woman, you only have so many years of fertility. So it almost like bothers me because it's like I never had the urge to have kids, but then part of me was like, did I even let myself mentally go to a place to know if I wanted kids? Because I never even thought of it as something that was possible for me. Because I was just like,
yeah,
I was this, punk kid. So I was just anti anything traditional, anything normal. I'm not that. Like, yeah, I just want to be as bad and cool as possible, basically. And that led me to a life of misery and drug addiction. So like it's really